A solution of the conspiracy. The annexed letter, which has been cavilled at, as much as copied, is a rationale of the conspiracy, combined from the government's own officers. When it was written, it was believed to be true. The evidence at the trial has confirmed much of it. I reprint it to show how men's ingenuities were at work to account for the conception and progress of the plot. Washington, May 2nd. Justice and fame are equally and simultaneously satisfied. The president is not yet in his sarcophagus, but all the conspirators against his life, with a minor exception or two, are in their prison cells waiting for the halter. The dark and bloody plot against a good ruler's life is now so fully unraveled that I may make it plain to you. There is nothing to be gained by further waiting. The trials are proceeding, the evidence is mountain high. Within a week the national scaffold will have done its work, and be laid away forever. This prompt and necessary justice will signal the last public assassination in America. Borgia, and Medici, and Brinvilliers have left no descendants on this side of the world. The conspiracy was both the greatest and the smallest of our cycle. Narrowed in execution to a few, it was understood and connived at by a multitude. One man was its head and heart. Its accessories were so numerous that the trouble is not whom to suspect, but whom not accuse. Damning as the result must be to the character of our race, it must be admitted, in the light of facts, that Americans are as secretive and as skillful plotters as any people in the world. The Rye House plot, never fully understood, the many schemes of Mazzini, never fastened upon him sufficiently well for implication, yield in extent, darkness, and intricacy to the Republican plot against the president's life and those of his counselors. The police operations prove that the late murder is not a spasmodic and fitful crime, but long premeditated, and carried to consummation with as much cohesion and resolution as the murder of Alessandro de' Medici or Henri Cotter. I have been accused of canonizing Booth. Much as I denounce and deprecate his crime, holding him to be worthy of all execration, and so seeped in blood that the excuses of a century will fail to lift him out of the atmosphere of common felons, I still, at every new development, stand farther back in surprise and terror at the wonderful resources and extraordinary influence of one whom I had learned to consider a mere thespian, full of sound, fury, and assertion. Strange and anomalous as the facts may seem, John Wilkes Booth was the sole projector of the plot against the president which culminated in the taking of that good man's life. He had rolled under his tongue the sweet paragraphs of Shakespeare referring to Brutus, as had his father so well, that the old man named one son Junius Brutus, and the other John Wilkes, after the wild English agitator, until it became his ambition, like the wicked Lorenzino de' Medici, to stake his life upon one stroke for fame, the murder of a ruler obnoxious to the South. That Wilkes Booth was a Southern man from the first may be accounted for upon grounds of interest as well as of sympathy. It is insidious to find no higher incentive than appreciation, but on the stage this is the first and last motive, and as Edwin Booth made his success in the North and remained steadfast, Wilkes Booth was most truly applauded in the South, and became rebel. A false emotion of gratitude, as well as an impulse of mingled waywardness and gratitude, set John Wilkes's face from the first toward the North, and he burned to make his name a part of history, cried into fame by the applauses of the South. He hung to his bloody suggestion with dogged inflexibility, maintaining only one axiom above all the rest, that whatever minor parts might be enacted, Casca, Cassius, or what not, he was to be the dramatic Brutus, accepting that assassin's negativeness. In other words, the idea was to be his own, as well as the crowning blow. Booth shrank at first from murder, until another and less dangerous resolution failed. This was no less than the capture of the president's body, and its detention or transportation to the South. I do not rely on this assertion upon his sealed letter, where he avows it. There has been found upon a street within the city limits, a house belonging to one Mrs. Green, mined and furnished with underground apartments, manacles, and all the accessories to private imprisonment. Here the president, and as many as could be gagged and conveyed away with him, were to be concealed in the event of failure to run them into the Confederacy. Owing to his failure to group around him as many men as he desired, Booth abandoned the project of kidnapping, but the house was discovered last week, as represented, ready to be blown up at a moment's notice. It was at this time that Booth devised his triumphant route through the South. The dramatic element seems to have been never lacking in his design, and with all his base purposes he never failed to consider some subsequent notoriety to be enjoyed. He therefore shipped, before the end of 1864, his theatrical wardrobe from Canada to Nassau. After the commission of his crime he intended to reclaim it, and star through the South, drawing money as much by his crime as his abilities. When Booth began on his own responsibility to hunt for accomplices, he found his theory at fault. The bold men he had dreamed of refused to join him in the rash attempt at kidnapping the president, and were too conscientious to meditate murder. All those who presented themselves were military men, unwilling to be subordinate to a civilian and a mere play actor, and the mortified bravo found himself therefore compelled to sink to a petty rank in the plot, or to make use of base and despicable assistance. His vanity found it easier to compound with the second alternative than the first. Here began the first resolve, which, in its mere animal estate, we may name courage. Booth found that a tragedy in real life could no more be enacted without greasy-faced and knock-kneed supernumeraries than upon the mimic stage. Your first citizen, who swings a stave for Mark Antony, and drinks hard porter behind the flies is very like the bravo of real life, who murders between his cocktails at the nearest bar. Wilkes Booth had passed the ordeal of a garlicky greenroom, and did not shrink from the broader and ranker greenroom of real life. He assembled around him, one by one, the cutthroats at whom his soul would have revolted, except that he had become, by resolve, a cutthroat in himself. About this time certain gentlemen in Canada began to be unenviably known. I abstain from giving their names, because unaware of how far they seconded this crime, if at all. But they seconded as infamous things, such as cowardly raids from neutral territory into the States, bank robbings, lake pirating, city burning, counterfeiting, railway sundering, and the importation of yellow fever into peaceful and unoffending communities. I make no charges against those whom I do not know, but simply say that the Confederate agents, Jacob Thompson, Larry McDonald, Clement Clay, and some others, had already accomplished enough villainy to make Wilkes Booth, on the 1st of the present year, believe that he had but to seek an interview with them. He visited the provinces once certainly, and 3 times it is believed, stopping in Montreal at St. Lawrence Hall, and banking $455 odd at the Ontario Bank. This was his own money. I have myself seen his bank book with the single entry of this amount. It was found in the room of Atzerodt at Kirkwood's Hotel. From this visit, whatever encouragement Booth received, he continued in systematic correspondence with one or more of those agents down to the commission of his crime. I dare not say how far each of these agents was implicated. My personal conviction is that they were neither loath to the murder nor astonished when it had been done. They had money with discretion from the Confederacy, though acting at discretion and outside of responsibility, and always, at every wild adventure, they instructed their dupes that each man took his life in his hand on every incursion into the North. So Beale took his, raiding on the Great Lakes. So Kennedy took his, on a midnight bonfire tramp into the metropolis. So took the St. Albans raiders their lives in their palms, dashing into a peaceful town. And if these agents entertained Wilkes Booth's suggestion at all, they plainly told him that he carried his life in his dagger's edge, and could expect from them neither aid nor exculpation. Some one or all of these agents furnished Booth with a murderer. The fellow Wood or Payne, who stabbed Mr. Seward and was caught at Mrs. Surratt's house in Washington. He was one of 3 Kentucky brothers, all outlaws, and had himself, it is believed, accompanied one of his brothers, who is known to have been at St. Albans on the day of the bank delivery. This Payne, besides being positively identified as the assassin of the Sewards, had no friends nor haunts in Washington. He was simply a dispatched murderer, and after the night of the crime, struck northward of the frontier, instead of southward in the company of Booth. The proof of this will follow in the course of the article. While I assert that the Canadian agents knew Booth and patted his back, calling him, like Macbeth, the prince of cutthroats, I am equally certain that Booth's project was unknown in Richmond. No word, nor written line, no clue of any sort has been found attaching Booth to the Confederate authorities. The most that can be urged to meet preposterous claims of this sort is, that out of the rebellion grew the murder, which is like attributing the measles to the creation of man. But MacDonald and his party had money at discretion, and under their control the vilest fellows on the continent. Their personal influence over those errant ones amounted to omnipotence. Most of the latter were young and sanguine people, like Beale and Booth. Their plots were made up at St. Catharines, Toronto, and Montreal, and they have maintained since the war began rebel mail routes between Canada and Richmond, leading directly past Washington. If Booth received no positive instructions, he was at any rate adjudged a man likely to be of use, and therefore introduced to the rebel agencies in and around Washington. Doubtless by direct letter, or verbal instruction, he received a password to the house of Mrs. Surratt. Half applauded, half rebuffed by the rebel agents in Canada, Booth's impressions of his visit were just those which would wet him soonest for the tragedy. His vanity had been fed by the assurance that success depended upon himself alone, and that as he had the responsibility he would absorb the fame, and the method of correspondence was of that dark and mysterious shape which powerfully operated upon his dramatic temperament. What could please an actor, and the son of an actor, better than to mingle as a principal in a real conspiracy, the aims of which were pseudo-patriotic, and the end so astounding that at its coming the whole globe would reel? Booth reasoned that the ancient world would not feel more sensitively the death of Julius Caesar than the sudden taking off of Abraham Lincoln. And so he grew into the idea of murder. It became his business thought. It was his recreation and his study. He had not worked half so hard for histrionic success as for his terrible graduation into an assassin. He had fought often on the boards, and seen men die in well-imitated horror, with flowing blood upon his keen sword's edge, and the strong stride of mimic victory with which he flourished his weapon at the closing of the curtain. He embraced conspiracy like an old diplomatist, and found in the woman and the spot subjects for emulation. Southeast of Washington stretches a tapering peninsula, composed of 4 fertile counties, which at the remote tip make Point Lookout, and do not contain any town within them of more than a few hundred inhabitants. Tobacco has ruined the land of these, and slavery has ruined the people. Yet in the beginning they were of that splendid stock of Calvert and Lord Baltimore, but retain today only the religion of the peaceful founder. I mention it as an exceptional and remarkable fact, that every conspirator in custody is by education a Catholic. These are our most loyal citizens elsewhere, but the western shore of Maryland is a noxious and pestilential place for patriotism. The county immediately outside of the District of Columbia, to the south, is named Prince George's, and the pleasantest village of this county, close to Washington, is called Surrattsville. This consists of a few cabins at a crossroad, surrounding a fine old hotel, the master whereof, giving the settlement his name, left the property to his wife, who for a long time carried it on with indifferent success. Having a son and several daughters, she moved to Washington soon after the beginning of the war and let the tavern to a trusty friend, one John Lloyd. Surrattsville has gained nothing in patronage or business from the war, except that it became at an early date a rebel post office. The great secret mail from Matthias Creek, Virginia, to Port Tobacco, struck Surrattsville, and thence headed off to the east to Washington, going meanderingly north. Of this poet route Mrs. Surratt was a manageress, and John Lloyd, when he rented her hotel, assumed the responsibility of looking out for the mail, as well the duty of making Mrs. Surratt at home when she chose to visit him. So Surrattsville, only 10 miles from Washington, has been throughout the war a sect of conspiracy. It was like a suburb of Richmond, reaching quite up to the rival capital, and though the few Unionists on the peninsula knew its reputation well enough, nothing of the sort came out until the murder. Treason never found a better agent than Mrs. Surratt. She is a large, masculine, self-possessed female, mistress of her house, and as lithe a rebel as Belle Boyd or Mrs. Greenhoff. She has not the flip pantry and menace of the first, nor the social power of the second, but the rebellion has found no fitter agent. At her country tavern and Washington home Booth was made welcome, and there began the muttered murder against the nation and mankind. The acquaintance of Mrs. Surratt in Lower Maryland undoubtedly suggested to Booth the route of escape, and made him known to his subsequent accomplices. Last fall he visited the entire region, as far as Leonardstown, in St. Mary's County, professing to be in search of land but really hunting up Confederates upon whom he could depend. At this time he bought a map, a fellow to which I have seen among Atzerott's effects, published at Buffalo for the rebel government, and marking at haphazard all the Maryland villages, but without tracing the highroads at all. The absence of these roads, it will be seen hereafter, very nearly misled Booth during his crippled flight. It could not but have struck Booth that this isolated part of Maryland, ignorant and rebel to the brim, without telegraph or railways, or direct stage routes, belted with swamps and broken by dense timber, afforded extraordinary opportunities for shelter and escape. Only the Coast Survey had any adequate map of it. It was Ultima Thule to all intents, and treason might subsist in welcome upon it for 1,000 years. When Booth cast around him for assistance, he naturally selected those men whom he could control. The first that recommended himself was one Harold, a youth of inane and plastic character, carried away by the example of an actor, and full of execrable quotations, going to show that he was an imitator of the master spirit both in text and admiration. This Harold was a gunner, and therefore versed in arms. He had traversed the whole lower portion of Maryland, and was therefore a geographer as well as a tool. His friends lived at every farmhouse between Washington and Leonardsville, and he was respectably enough connected, so as to make his association creditable as well as useful. Harold, whose picture I have seen, is a dull-faced, shallow boy, smooth-haired, and provincial. He had no money nor employment, except that he clerked for a druggist a while, until he knew Wilkes Booth, who looked at him only once, and bought his soul for a smile. Harold was infatuated by Booth as a woman by a soldier. He copied his gait and tone, adopted his opinions, and was unhappy out of his society. Booth gave him money, mysteriously obtained, and together they made the acquaintance of young John Surratt, son of the conspiratress. Young Surratt does not appear to have been a puissant spirit in the scheme. Indeed, all design and influence therein was absorbed by Mrs. Surratt and Booth. The latter was the head and heart of the plot, Mrs. Surratt was his anchor, and the rest of the boys were disciples to Iscariot and Jezebel. John Surratt, a youth of strong southern physiognomy, beardless and lanky, knew of the murder and connived at it. Sam Arnold and one McLaughlin were to have been parties to it, but backed out in the end. They all relied upon Mrs. Surratt, and took their cues from Wilkes Booth. The conspiracy had its own time and kept its own counsel. Murder, except among the principals, was seldom mentioned except by genteel implication. But they all publicly agreed that Mr. Lincoln ought to be shot, and that the North was a race of fratricides. Much was said of Brutus, and Booth repeated heroic passages to the delight of Harold, who learned them also, and wondered if he was not born to greatness. In this growing darkness, where all rehearsed cold-hearted murder, Wilkes Booth grew great of stature. He had found a purpose consonant with his evil nature and bad influence over weak men, so he grew moodier, more vigilant, more plausible. By mien and temperament he was born to handle a stiletto. We have no face so markedly Italian, it would stand for Caesar Borgia any day in the year. All the rest were swayed or persuaded by Booth. His schemes were three in order. First, to kidnap the president and cabinet, and run them south or blow them up. 2d. Kidnapping failed, to murder the president and the rest and seek shelter in the Confederate capital. 3d. Of the rebellion failed, to be its avenger, and throw the country into consternation, while he escaped by the unfrequented parts of Maryland. When this last resolution had been made, the plot was both contracted and extended. There were made two distinct circles of confidants, those aware of the meditated murder, and those who might shrink from murder, the willing accessories for a lesser object. Two colleagues for blood were at once accepted, Payne and Atzerodt. The former I have sketched. He is believed to have visited Washington once before, at Booth's citation, for the murder was at first fixed for the day of inauguration. Atzerodt was a fellow of German descent, who had led a desperate life at Port Tobacco, where he was a house painter. He had been a blockade runner across the Potomac, and a mail carrier. When Booth and Mrs. Surratt broke the design to him, with a suggestion that there was wealth in it, he embraced the offer at once, and bought a dirk and pistol. Payne also came from the north to Washington, and, as fate would have it, the president was announced to appear at Ford's Theater in public. There the resolve of blood was reduced to a definite moment. On the night before the crime, Booth found on whom he could rely. John Surratt was sent northward by his mother on Thursday. Sam Arnold and McLaughlin, each of whom was to kill a cabinet officer, grew pigeon-livered and ran away. Harold, true to his partiality, lingered around Booth to the end. Atzerodt went so far as to take his knife and pistol to Kirkwood's, where President Johnson was stopping, and hid them under the bed. But either his courage failed, or a trifling accident deranged his plan. But Payne, a professional murderer, stood game, and fought his way over prostrate figures to his sick victim's bed. There was great confusion and terror among the tacit and rash conspirators on Thursday night. They had looked upon the plot as of a melodrama, and found to their horror that John Wilkes Booth meant to do murder. 6 weeks before the murder, young John Surratt had taken 2 splendid repeating carbines to Surrattville and told John Lloyd to secret them. The latter made a hole in the wainscoting and suspended them from strings, so that they fell within the plastered wall of the room below. On the very afternoon of the murder, Mrs. Surratt was driven to Surrattsville, and she told John Lloyd to have the carbines ready because they would be called for that night. Harold was made quartermaster, and hired the horses. He and Atzerodt were mounted between 8 o'clock and the time of the murder, and riding about the streets together. The whole party was prepared for a long ride, as their spurs and gauntlets show. It may have been their design to ride in company to the lower Potomac, and by their numbers exact subsistence and transportation, but all edifices of murder lack a cornerstone. We only know that Booth ate and talked well during the day, that he never seemed so deeply involved in oil, and that there is a hiatus between his supper here and his appearance at Ford's Theater. Lloyd, I may interpolate, ordered his wife a few days before the murder to go on a visit to Allen's Fresh. She says she does not know why she was so sent away, but swears that it is so. Harold, 3 weeks before the murder, visited Port Tobacco, and said that the next time the boys heard of him he would be in Spain. He added that with Spain there was no extradition treaty. He said at Surrattsville that he meant to make a barrel of money, or his neck would stretch. Atzerodt said that if he ever came to Port Tobacco again he would be rich enough to buy the whole place. Wilkes Booth told a friend to go to Ford's on Friday night and see the best acting in the world. At Ford's Theater, on Friday night, there were many standers in the neighborhood of the door, and along the dress circle in the direction of the private box where the president sat. The play went on pleasantly, though Mr. Wilkes Booth, an observer of the audience, visited the stage and took note of the positions. His alleged associate, the stage carpenter, then received quiet orders to clear the passage by the wings from the prompter's post to the stage door. All this time, Mr. Lincoln, in his family circle, unconscious of the death that crowded fast upon him, watched the pleasantry and smiled and felt heartful of gentleness. Suddenly there was a murmur near the audience door, as of a man speaking above his bound. He said, 9 o'clock and 45 minutes. These words were reiterated from mouth to mouth until they passed the theater door, and were heard upon the sidewalk. Directly a voice cried, in the same slightly raised monotone, 9 o'clock and 50 minutes. This also passed from man to man, until it touched the street like a shutter. 9 o'clock and 55 minutes, said the same relentless voice. After the next interval, each of which narrowed to a lesser span the life of the good president. 10 o'clock here sounded, and conspiring echoes set in reverberation. 10 o'clock. So like a creeping thing, from lip to lip, went 10 o'clock and 5 minutes. An interval. 10 o'clock and 10 minutes. At this instant Wilkes Booth appeared in the door of the theater, and the men who had repeated the time so faithfully and so ominously scattered at his coming, as at some warning phantom. 15 minutes afterwards the telegraph wires were cut. All this is so dramatic that I fear to excite a laugh when I write it. But it is true and proven, and I do not say it but report it. All evil deeds go wrong. While the click of the pistol, taking the president's life, went like a pang through the theater, Payne was spilling blood in Mr. Seward's house from threshold to sick chamber. But Booth's broken leg delayed him or made him lose his general calmness, and he and Harold left Payne no to his fate. I have not adverted to the hole bored with a gimlet in the entry door of Mr. Lincoln's box, and cut out with a penknife. The theory that the pistol ball of Booth passed through this hole is exploded. And the stage carpenter may have to answer for this little orifice with all his neck. For when Booth leaped from the box he strode straight across the stage by the footlights, reaching the prompter's post, which is immediately behind that private box opposite Mr. Lincoln. From this box to the stage door in the rear, the passageway leads behind the ends of the scenes, and if generally either closest up by one or more withdrawn scenes, or so narrow that only by doubling and turning sidewise can one pass along. On this fearful night, however, the scenes were so adjusted to the murderer's design that he had a free aisle from the foot of the stage to the exit door. Within 15 minutes after the murder the wires were severed entirely around the city, excepting only a secret wire for government uses, which leads to Old Point. I am told that by this wire the government reached the fortifications around Washington, first telegraphing all the way to Old Point, and then back to the outlying forts. This information comes to me from so many creditable channels that I must concede it. Payne, having, as he thought, made an end of Mr. Seward, which would have been the case but for Robinson, the nurse, mounted his horse, and attempted to find Booth. But the town was in alarm, and he galloped at once for the open country, taking as he imagined, the proper road for the East Branch. He rode at a killing pace, and when near Fort Lincoln, on the Baltimore Pike, his horse threw him headlong. Afoot and bewildered, he resolved to return to the city, whose lights he could plainly see, but before doing so Ho concealed himself some time, and made some almost absurd efforts to disguise himself. Cutting a cross-section from the woolen undershirt which covered his muscular arm, he made a rude cap of it, and threw away his bloody coat. This has since been found in the woods, and blood has been found also on his bosom and sleeves. He also spattered himself plentifully with mud and clay, and, taking an abandoned pick from the deserted entrenchments nearby, he struck at once for Washington. By the providence which always attends murder, he reached Mrs. Surratt's door just as the officers of the government were arresting her. They seized Payne at once, who had an awkward lie to urge in his defense, that he had come there to dig a trench. That night he dug a trench deep and broad enough for both of them to lie in forever. They washed his hands, and found them soft and womanish. His pockets contained tooth and nail brushes and a delicate pocket knife. All this apparel consorted ill with his assumed character. He is, without doubt, Mr. Seward's attempted murderer. Coarse, and hard, and calm, Mrs. Surratt shut up her house after the murder, and waited with her daughters till the officers came. She was imperturbable, and rebuked her girls for weeping, and would have gone to jail like a statue, but that in her extremity, Payne knocked at her door. He had come, he said, to dig a ditch for Mrs. Surratt, whom he very well knew. But Mrs. Surratt protested that she had ever seen the man at all, and had no ditch to clean. "How fortunate, girls," she said, "that these officers are here. This man might have murdered us all." Her effrontery stamps her as worthy of companionship with Booth. Payne has been identified by a lodger of Mrs. Surratt's as having twice visited the house under the name of Wood. The girls will render valuable testimony in the trial. If John Surratt were in custody, the links would be complete. Atzerodt had a room almost directly over Vice President Johnson's. He had all the materials to do murder, but lost spirit or opportunity. He ran away so hastily that all his arms and baggage were discovered. A tremendous Bowie knife and a Colt's cavalry revolver were found between the mattresses of his bed. Booth's coat was also found there, showing conspired flight and company, and in it 3 boxes of cartridges, a map of Maryland, gauntlet for riding, a spur and a handkerchief marked with the name of Booth's mother, a mother's souvenir for a murderer's pocket. Atzerodt fled alone, and was found at the house of his uncle in Montgomery County. I do not know that any instrument of murder has ever made me thrill as when I drew this terrible Bowie knife from its sheath. Major O'Byrne, of New York, was the instigator of Atzerodt's discovery and arrest. I come now to the ride out of the city by the chief assassin and his dupe. Harold met Booth immediately after the crime in the next street, and they rode at a gallop past the patent office and over Capitol Hill. As they crossed the eastern branch at Uniontown, Booth gave his proper name to the officer at the bridge. This, which would seem to have been foolish, was, in reality, very shrewd. The officers believed that one of Booth's accomplices had given this name in order to put them out of the real Booth's track. So they made efforts elsewhere, and so Booth got a start. At midnight, precisely, the 2 horsemen stopped at Surrattsville, Booth remaining on his nag while Harold descended and knocked lustily at the door. Lloyd, the landlord, came down at once, when Harold pushed past him into the bar, and obtained a bottle of whiskey, some of which he gave to Booth immediately. While Booth was drinking, Harold went upstairs and brought down one of the carbines. Lloyd started to get the other, but Harold said, "We don't want it. Booth has broken his leg and can't carry it." So the second carbine remained in the hall, where the officers afterward found it. As the 2 horsemen started to go off, Booth cried out to Lloyd, "Do you want to hear some news?" "I don't care much about it," cried Lloyd, by his own account. "We have murdered," said Booth, "the President and Secretary of State." And with this horrible confession, Booth and Harold dashed away in the midnight, across Prince George's County. On Saturday, before sunrise, Booth and Harold, who had ridden all night without stopping elsewhere, reached the house of Dr. Mudd, 3 miles from Bryantown. They contracted with him for $25 in greenbacks to set the broken leg. Harold, who knew Dr. Mudd, introduced Booth under another name, and stated that he had fallen from his horse during the night. The doctor remarked to Booth that he draped the lower part of his face while the leg was being set. He was silent, and in pain. Having no splits in the house, they split up an old-fashioned wooden bandbox and prepared them. The doctor was assisted by an Englishman, who at the same time began to hew out a pair of crutches. The inferior bone of the left leg was broken vertically across, and because vertically it did not yield when the crippled man walked upon it. The riding boot of Booth had to be cut from his foot, within were the words J. Wilkes. The doctor says he did not notice these, but that visual defect may cost him his neck. The 2 men waited around the house all day, but toward evening they slipped their horses from the stable and rode away in the direction of Allen's Fresh. Below Bryantown run certain deep and slimy swamps. Along the belt of these Booth and Harold picked up a Negro named Swan, who volunteered to show them the road for $2. They gave him 5 more to show them the route to Allen's Fresh, but really wished, as their actions intimated, to gain the house of one Sam Cox, a notorious rebel, and probably well advised of the plot. They reached the house at midnight. It is a fine dwelling, one of the best in Maryland. And after hallooing for some time, Cox came down to the door himself. As soon as he opened it and beheld who the strangers were, he instantly blew out a candle he held in his hand, and without a word pulled them into the house, the Negro remaining in the yard. The Confederates remained in Cox's house till 4 a.m., during which time, the Negro saw them drink and eat heartily, but when they reappeared they spoke in a loud tone, so that Swan could hear them, against the hospitality of Cox. All this was meant to influence the darky, but their motives were as apparent as their words. He conducted them 3 miles further on, when they told him that now they knew the way, and giving him $5 more, making 12 in all, told him to go back.